Here, I think this is.
Okay, so we'll call the meeting to order. And obviously it's the approval of the agenda and order of business. I don't have any changes, but that doesn't mean.
I have a report on the Municipal Planning Advisory Committee. Met last night. Just a brief update.
Okay. Anyone else? Somebody want to move the approval as amended?
So moved.
Second. Discussion. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Public input. I'm not specifically aware of any. Is there any? No? Okay. On to a pretty good start.
Wrong door.
Minutes of the previous meetings. Committee of the whole, April 4th. Any errors or omissions there, people?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Committee of the whole, April 11th. Same deal. Errors or omissions?
Motion to approve.
Second. Discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. There you go. Must be time for a break. Public presentations. Accessibility of the built environment, Nova Scotia. Maddie Adams, and I think you're going to do some.
I'll just do a quick introduction.
Oh, okay.
Because Owen and I were fighting about it earlier. So good morning, Council. As a follow-up to the recent R.B. Anderson presentation with regards to the building options, Maddie Adams has kindly agreed to come in and give a brief presentation on the provincial accessibility standards. Maddie Adams is a senior policy analyst at the Nova Scotia Accessibility Directorate, where they lead the development of Nova Scotia's accessibility standard for the built environment. So, over to you, Maddie.
Maddie, morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
We're happy to have you.
I absolutely love this part of the province, so it's always nice to drive down to the South Shore.
Where are you from?
I drove from Dartmouth this morning.
Oh,
Yeah, but I'm from Pictou County, so. Great, so I have slides up. I'll just begin with a quick visual description of myself for anyone who can't see me at the moment. So I am a white person, androgynous looking, wearing glasses, clean shaven, and light brown hair, and wearing a salmon colored button down this morning. And I'll try to do the same for my slides as I go. This might not be an approach that most folks take, but I like to describe the visuals on my slides so that everyone has the same access to them.
Okay.
And so let's begin. So the next slide, I like to preface everything I talk about with respect to accessibility with a bit of a disclaimer on language. Language around diverse groups is so sensitive and ever-changing, and we know that's true with people with disabilities. Some folks identify as disabled, some folks identify as deaf or blind or neurodivergent, and we strive to use the most inclusive and respectful language, and that will be throughout my presentation. I'll use the term people with disabilities. Nova Scotia has the highest rate of disability in Canada. You might have known this before. These are actually this is the new data that came out late 2023. These stats are actually increased from what they had been previously. And 37.9% of Nova Scotians over the age of 15 are living with one or more disabilities. So as you're thinking about the people in your community, as business owners are thinking about their customers, as we in the province are thinking about the people we serve, we're talking about a large portion of the population is actually living with disability. And so this work that we're doing may impact as many as 37% of Nova Scotians. Canada's disability rate is at 27%, so just for comparison there.
10% higher.
Yeah, quite high in Nova Scotia. So in Nova Scotia, I'll share just a wee bit of background. You might have heard this before, or it might be new, but I want to start us all off on the same playing field in terms of information. So Nova Scotia has an Accessibility Act. We are one of 6 provinces in Canada to have such legislation, and we were the 3rd to enact accessibility legislation, just after Ontario and Manitoba. The Act was created in collaboration with the disability community in Nova Scotia. So you might have heard of Bill 59, and the Bill 59 Alliance or group is still active, including there's a group on Facebook, and folks are still very passionate about the work to get the Accessibility Act enacted in Nova Scotia. It was adopted in 2017, and my team at the Accessibility Directorate, we're responsible for the administration of the Act. The Act itself is enabling legislation. So what it does is it enables the province to create regulations under the Act, including accessibility standards. And there's an image on the slide of the cover of the Act. All right, so Access by Design 2030 is government's accessibility strategy. So it's how are we going to make this Act, how are we going to carry out what we've committed to in this legislation. It has a goal of an accessible province by 2030. 2030 is closer than you could believe. We're talking only 6 years, less than 6 years away. And so in terms of what accessible by 2030 means, we should have all of our accessibility standards that we've committed to in place by then. There will still be work to do. We know that we won't be able to possibly remove all barriers by 2030, but we should have the enabling structure in place to continue that work. The priority focus areas in the strategy are awareness and capacity building. So part of our team is often out engaging with PPSBs like the municipalities and delivering awareness training, teaching folks about disability, about accessibility. We're also committed to the development of standards. That's a huge portion of what we do, and that's what I want to talk to you about today is the Built Environment Standard, which I'm leading. And then, of course, standards on their own are not sufficient if we're not aiding community with collaboration and support to understand the standards, to implement them, and if we're not enforcing compliance when there's non-compliance with standards. So there's commitments around that, as well as monitoring and evaluation. So how are we doing in accessibility? What are the barriers? And then government has committed to leading by example. So, accessibility standards, there's an image on the slide of a young kiddo playing on some outdoor play structures at an African Nova Scotian daycare. Standards are regulations under our Act, under the Accessibility Act, and they are minimum legal requirements. So compliance is required with the standards. Tools and training will be available to support implementation of the standards and to support compliance. And think of standards as sort of the pass mark. So complying with a standard is like passing. Then there might be all sorts of accompanying materials, guidelines, best practices, which some folks may be able, some organizations may be able to take advantage of and go above and beyond a standard, and some, for whatever reasons, capacity, budget, what have you, might only be able to meet the standards. On the next slide, I've listed the accessibility standards that the province has committed to. So the province has committed to 6 accessibility standards, and we're aiming to implement them in this order. So built environment first. Of course, the built environment sort of underpins all of the other areas, because how do you navigate places and spaces in order to access things like employment and education? So there are standards for employment, education, goods and services, public transportation, and information communications. So those are the 6 areas. I'm going to speak to you today about built environment. And on the slide, there was a diverse group of folks looking at some art on a wall. So the built environment, it's a bit of a, if you're not familiar with the term, it can sound kind of like jargon, but it really just means the places in which we live, work, learn, and play. I always like to stress that we've included play in our definition, so we're not just talking about getting kids to school, getting adults to their jobs. We're also talking about parks, recreation, engagement in your community. And an example on the slide, there's a fellow who's sitting in a beach wheelchair on top of a Moby mat, smiling with his dog. And so the built environment standard work has been underway since 2019. Recommendations were submitted to government in 2020 and 2021 by our board, the Accessibility Advisory Board. Since that time, we've had to carefully review each of the recommendations and develop a proposed standard. That standard was shared with Nova Scotians in the fall of 2023 to allow for feedback. You may have even given feedback on that yourselves. The expected standard is to be adopted in 2024, pending approvals. On the next slide, there's an individual who is using a lift to get on a stage and perform, and he's using a power wheelchair, and you see a set of stairs beside him. So without that lift there, how would he get onto the stage to play that beautiful piano behind him? So in terms of the recommendations for the built environment, there were 134 recommendations in total. When I say recommendations, some were maybe a sentence long and some were paragraphs long. So in total, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of design elements and items being recommended to the province for the standard. And it included everything from site selection in terms of where we're building, where we're leasing spaces, insides of buildings, outside of buildings, accessible parking, emergency systems, and then specific recommendations around schools, public libraries, and parks and rec, as well as signage and wayfinding. All of those recommendations are available online. So on the next slide, we have two folks strolling through town in their manual wheelchairs together. They almost look like they're racing. I quite like this picture. So government is using the recommendations now to develop the standard. We're also developing accompanying materials such as non-enforceable guidelines, and also the Accessibility Advisory Board made recommendations for amendments to the Nova Scotia Building Code. So I will just say the Nova Scotia Building Code belongs, that set of regulations belongs to Municipal Affairs and Housing, not to the Accessibility Directorate, but we've been working very closely with them on any amendments to the code, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And then accessibility is also being addressed via accessibility plans. So the government's accessibility plan, as well as PPSB's accessibility plans. So, I wish I was in a place to be able to tell you exactly what is going to be in the standard. We're not there yet. We're still, you understand how it goes. We're still seeking government approval, and before we have approvals, we can't commit entirely to what will be in it. Things can still change, but I can speak in general to what to expect. The standard itself will cover aspects of the built environment that aren't covered by the building code. So what nobody wants is to have to look at the building code regulations and then go look at another set of regulations to try to figure out how to build a building. We didn't want to duplicate regulations in that way. So instead we worked with Municipal Affairs and Housing, and where anything was appropriate to fit in the building code, such as accessibility features inside and outside of buildings, we worked together to make proposed amendments to the building code. So the standard under the Accessibility Act will address accessibility of the built environment outside of buildings. That means places like parks, beaches, trails, that type of thing, as well as the requirement to develop accessibility plans. The standard itself takes a similar approach to the building code. It applies to new constructions, so new designs, new builds, as well as redevelopments.
Can I just ask, will it only apply to public spaces or? Yeah.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Some parts will only apply to, say, prescribed public sector bodies or government in Nova Scotia, and some parts will apply broadly, including to businesses.
What about private homes?
Yeah, so great question. Under our act, private homes with 3 or fewer dwellings are exempt. So multi-unit residential housing, 4 or more units can be included within the standard work, but not single family homes. Yeah, great question. So there are the two types of regulations within the standard. There are technical design requirements, such as how to design a trail, how to design outdoor eating areas, that type of thing. And then there's the requirement for accessibility planning. An example would be maintenance of parking areas, making sure those lines are painted on, the accessibility signage is there, that kind of thing. So yeah, some regulations will apply only to government PPSBs. None will apply to, say, your own private backyard. And we're proposing that compliance begin in April of 2026 to allow for an education period between now and then, and to allow for the development of planning for infrastructure. We know infrastructure plans are developed years in advance, and so the first 2 years would be focused on education and awareness. This slide's a bit wordy, but the proposed standard was made available to the public, and this is what was in it. So in terms of what would apply to municipalities in this case, what would apply to municipalities, there were up to 20 requirements in the proposed standard, which included things like site selection, so where you're building, curb ramps, exterior stairs, parking areas, on-street parking, so where you decide those accessible spaces go, sidewalks and how you're designing them, temporary sidewalks and how you're designing them, pedestrian control signals, so particularly the accessible ones. So if you're familiar with that sound, that's an accessible pedestrian signal. Placement of defibrillators in a building, lockers, pools, outdoor public eating areas, benches, outdoor play spaces. So these are some of the pieces that could apply to municipalities. And then some plans for snow and ice control, maintenance of parking areas, plans for accessibility entrances, and the availability of accessible washrooms. We do have a compliance and enforcement framework. It has been approved and it's available on our website. I will say the goal in accessibility has never been about fining folks or it's really not, the goal is not to be punitive. The goal is to work with organizations to help bring them into compliance. At the end of the day, what we want is the person with a disability, myself, could be any number of us in this room, we want those people to be able to access places and spaces. So the compliance framework really reflects that in that it focuses on education and awareness at the outset. And when there are cases of non-compliance, let's say it's with a municipality or a business, our goal would be to work with you or to work with the business to say, okay, maybe you missed this is not up to the standard, and to help bring folks along into compliance. That framework is available online. It does outline 5 steps to achieving compliance, and any sort of enforcement measures would sort of be a last approach to achieving compliance. There's an image on the slide of Ellen. You're on the slide here. We have our own Ellen Johnson here getting off of a Bridgewater Transit bus on this slide. And so this slide's about education, about the standards. So we have developed an education plan. It includes activities for the next 2 years, which includes a lot more of this kind of thing, getting out into communities, being in the regions, engaging with folks, sharing information. Education and awareness will be key to compliance with the standard. We know that a set of rules can seem arduous. It can seem like, oh, one more thing you have to do. But if you understand the purpose and the intent behind accessibility standards, and that we're actually talking about, almost 40% of Nova Scotians, then you understand this is really important work, and most folks are behind the work anyway and supportive. The plan will really get at sort of both the why it's important and the technical components. And it incorporates feedback that we've received, and it will continue to incorporate feedback we receive. So we've received feedback from PPSBs, municipalities, throughout the development of the standard, as well as feedback from the public and from businesses. And the education plan is meant to be responsive within the resources we're allowed. And so if we identify new areas or gaps, we'll try to educate folks about the standard as we can. Engaging with PPSBs is key in this work. So I'm so glad that you're having me here today, and I hope to be back when the standard is adopted. The other piece that folks want to know a lot about is the building code amendments. And so I will preface what I'm saying as I don't work for Municipal Affairs and Housing. I've worked very closely with them over the last 2 years in the development of this work. But now that the work is sort of to be adopted by them, we're continuing to work together, but the sort of enactment of the code follows its regular process. So the proposed amendments to the building code happen routinely anyways. So the code is updated to adopt the national codes as the national codes are updated. So there's the 2020 National Building Code, National Plumbing Code, and National Energy Codes. So Nova Scotia adopts those through the Nova Scotia Building Code regulations. What we've done is where we could add any accessibility components into the building code, we've worked together with Municipal Affairs and Housing to do that. And so an example of something you might see might be wider requirements for pathways or clear space requirements for wheelchairs. As mobility devices are getting bigger, space requirements are bigger. And there's a few sort of new additions to the code that came from recommendations that we've received. An example would be emergency eye wash stations. If you've ever used one, you're expected to be standing, but what if you're seated in a wheelchair? So having access to accessible emergency equipment would be a sort of a new addition we've proposed to the code. So this, I gave a slide that outlines some of these examples in the code. More accessible units in roofed accommodations, more accessible units in suites of residential care or residential occupancies, a requirement for residential occupancies to be visitable. So again, this would be multi-unit housing. So if you're in a large condo building and your friend uses a wheelchair, they should be able to come visit you, right? So the space should be accessible for that. Pedestrian entrances should be accessible, including power door operators that stay open long enough, accessible water closets and washrooms, accessible kitchens, break rooms, water bottle filling stations. So some of these already existed in the code and they've just been amended, and some are new.
Half of the power door openings don't stay open long enough, no matter how
Yes.
capable you are.
Power door operators are a tricky one. And of course, the code requires that they're in place, but it doesn't continue to go back and make sure they're working.
Yeah.
And I'll actually touch on that one in a minute. Okay, on the next slide, I talk about guidelines. So if you've ever had the chance to see sledge hockey, what a cool sport. There's a kiddo who's in the goalie net there sitting on a sledge. And so if you've not had a chance to see sledge hockey, check it out. What a really cool adapted sport. We are developing guidelines for the built environment as well. So this is that piece I was touching on earlier. We know for some folks, just meeting the requirements of the standard might be all they're able to do at that point in time. And we know there are folks who have the resources, the budget, the human capacity, whatever it is, they have the ability to go above and beyond. So we're producing guidelines that will have best practices for accessibility in the built environment. These are pieces that aren't suitable for regulations. I'll give you an example. We received several recommendations around lighting. Some folks who are partially sighted or low vision require brighter lights so they can see. Some folks who may have just had a brain injury or who are on the autism spectrum require reduced lighting. So how do you regulate something when actually there's a competing need here? So something like a guideline would be more appropriate for that type of example. And it might say to include a variety of lighting options. And so guidelines are available. They give folks guidance on how to make spaces as accessible as possible, and will of course encourage organizations, especially PPSBs, to follow the guidelines where they can. And of course, government itself, leading by example, will follow the guidelines where possible. And then there's also accessibility planning. And so the standard is sort of one piece of this big puzzle, but then there's the planning that we are doing at the provincial level and that municipalities are doing at the municipal level. So in the next slide, there's an image of government's accessibility plan. This is available online, and you're welcome to take a look. The built environment is a key priority of this plan, and it identifies actions related to policies, programs, services, the workspace. So a number of activities happening throughout to audit spaces, to identify what needs to be corrected and try to remove barriers. We also have an awareness campaign. If you're not familiar with this, I really highly encourage you to check it out today. It includes all sorts of free posters, stickers, that kind of thing that you can download the PDFs of and use them in your own materials. For example, there's a signature block you can include in your email that says access includes everyone. It doesn't have the Nova Scotia branding, so it's available for anyone to use. On the slide, there is a poster from the awareness campaign. Shows 3 kids on a Saturday morning play date, and one of them's using adapted equipment to play video games. So the awareness campaign is really that piece we're talking about around the attitudes. So trying to raise awareness of accessibility, why it matters, and also trying to address some of the stigma and attitudinal barriers. It's available in a number of formats. We have TV ads, there's social media, digital media, print media. But that link there with the resource hub, it has all sorts available online. It also, all of the PPSB plans, including your own joint plan with Lunenburg, Mahone Bay, Bridgewater, it's listed on there as well. And so if you ever want to go see, okay, what's another municipality doing? That's all listed on there so that you can access it. And then speaking of your accessibility plan, I put an image of it on my slide. I'm trying to be a keener here. So as you know, PPSBs do have accessibility plans, and you are required to update them. So PPSB plans for municipalities are due April 1st, 2025. There's a new accessibility planning toolkit coming soon, so stay tuned for that. I will just quickly touch on, you might be wondering about the Office of Equity and Anti-Racism has developed the Dismantling Racism and Hate Act, which will also require prescribed entities to develop plans. And so we're working very closely with them. They're also situated within Justice. We have the same ministry.
I want to just stop for a second. We have a bunch of people coming.
Yeah.
We've got chairs in the corner here, yeah?
Okay, yeah. Morning. The student council from
Yes,
Florida Heights.
welcome. So we're working closely with the Office of Equity and Anti-Racism. What we don't want is for there to be 2 requirements for you to develop plans and you're not able to integrate them in some way. So if it's appropriate for you to develop your anti-hate plans, your anti-racism and equity plans rather, and your plans for accessibility, if you want to combine those, there will be opportunities to do that. And more information's coming on those as well. Other accessibility work in the built environment. So we know that this is a bit of a hot topic, is restaurants in Nova Scotia. So this is an area where it seems like it's the same thing as the accessibility standard, but it's actually different. But we're aware that to the business owner, it may all seem like the same piece of accessibility work coming from the province. This piece of work, though, has originated from, in September 2018, the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission Board of Inquiry made a decision based on a human rights case to administer and enforce the words washroom facilities for the public available in a convenient location to mean accessible as well. So the requirements that I'm speaking about on this slide are specifically for restaurants only. Restaurant does include any space where you order food and you eat and pay before or after you're served. It can include a premise where there's a counter, a food bar, or a cafeteria line. So what it doesn't include would be sort of takeout only places, but any sort of eat-in restaurant canteen type thing would be covered as restaurant under the Department of Environment and Climate Change's regulations for food safety. So as a result of the decision, all new restaurants in Nova Scotia are required to be wheelchair accessible in order to be eligible for a food establishment permit. So this means they need a barrier-free path of travel into the restaurant, throughout the restaurant, and to the washroom. Yeah. And so this applies to what we call new restaurants, so any restaurant that's newly opening, or if it's an existing restaurant that was closed for more than a year, say it was closed for 14 months and reopened, that would be considered a new restaurant. And if you are modifying an existing restaurant, you would be expected to update the space to meet the new code, but that's the same as all spaces. So the Nova Scotia Building Code does outline the requirements for accessibility for restaurants. There is an exemption within the code for heritage buildings, and we know accessibility in heritage buildings is very tricky. We know that. I know I'm sitting in Chester right now, and here, Lunenburg, all of the South Shore really have...
Half of what we own is heritage.
Half of what you own is heritage, exactly. So, and that's really important to your community. So finding that balance between accessibility and maintaining heritage is important. The heritage exemption within the building code, though, does not apply to restaurants. So that is a tricky that's a tricky one to navigate. So what this does mean is that spaces that are trying to open a new restaurant, if they're in a space where they can't provide a barrier-free entrance, or say they're in a basement or on the second floor, there's no lift available, they wouldn't be able to open a new restaurant in that space. And so what I will say is, in order to get a food permit, there are requirements of a letter from a licensed professional from the Nova Scotia Association of Architects or from Engineers Nova Scotia, just stating the compliance with the code requirements. And then there is work underway to develop resources available to restaurants. We do have the Business Accessibility Grant in Nova Scotia. It's administered through Communities, Culture, Tourism, and Heritage, and restaurants can apply to update their space and make it accessible through that grant. And then there's other work happening with the Restaurant Association of Nova Scotia and ongoing work with Department of Environment and Climate Change to support restaurants with this work.
A quick way to tell you, but I'm not very good at that. Does this apply to bars only?
Yes, if they require a food safety permit.
But if they don't serve food, then I guess I'm just...
If they're serving food or beverage within the space,
Beverages.
yeah. If it's takeout, then that's different. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So to sort of end off my slide, I have a few more, or my presentation, I have a few more slides on some things to keep in mind when it comes to accessibility. So in the next slide, we already touched on this. This is a slide of someone using a manual wheelchair. They're leaving an accessible washroom and they're about to push to open automatic door opener. We know that maintenance is actually key to accessibility in the built environment. We can design places and spaces to be accessible, but if that automatic door opener isn't working, or if staff, for example, are blocking an accessible entrance by storing items in front of it, these are things that can really impact accessibility, and they're actually sometimes good low-hanging fruit that are easy to solve. Updating, we're not talking about reconstructing your whole space. Sometimes it's about the way we use the space, the way we manage a space. The next slide, someone's toggling their joystick in their power wheelchair, and so this one is so key. If you're doing any design work, whether it's design of the built environment or even design of services or programs you offer, engage people with disabilities early on in the process, especially with the built environment. Once you've built a building, it's really hard to unbuild it and redo it properly. It's like trying to unbake a cake. But engaging with people with disabilities early on, they might be able to say, actually, look, there's not enough space for me to turn my wheelchair in the way you designed this, whatever. And so that insight can be invaluable early on in the process. This slide, we're all familiar with these. It's a big crack in a sidewalk. And so it just says be proactive in identifying barriers in your community. So sometimes identifying barriers is the most important part. Once you know they're there, some can be very easy to correct, but if you're not tracking them and really being proactive in identifying where the barriers are, then that can prevent you from being accessible as well. I did touch on this one earlier, so building code, accessibility standards are minimum requirements. There's a kiddo in a snoozlin room, a sensory room there on the slide. On the next slide, there's some elders in a care facility. This is in Cape Breton. And of course, we know we have an aging population. And aging means rising demand for accessible spaces. So, your parents, grandparents, friends, yourself, a lot of folks who are aging may not actually identify as having a disability, but as you age, you may have reduced mobility, you may have access needs, and so we know that as we age, our need for accessible spaces increases. And then lastly, just a reminder to access includes everyone, so make sure you're being inclusive in who you're designing your places and spaces for. My last few slides include some links that you're welcome to follow up on. So there's resources for the built environment. When in doubt, check out the Canadian Standards Association B651, the 2023 version. That is sort of the leading best practice in accessible design in Canada. There's some other links for you there. There's a slide on grants and funding. And then there is a slide on videos to learn more. So these are just some short videos on what are disabilities, intersectionality. If you're hosting any events, they did great work at NSCC to translate the Mi'kmaq Honor Song into ASL. So there's a video of that you can use in the opening of your events if you want, and also linked to Universal Design. That's it for me, and then I have time to answer any questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Informative. Questions, people? I mean, I asked all mine.
No, that's great.
Yes, Tina.
Just a statement, so certainly thank you for being here, and I know that the staff, I'm sure, is, married up with the fact that we are looking, if you will, at renovating, building new, expanding, and all the above. So
yes,
very much appreciated receiving this last week and going through the slides and learning more today. Absolutely, reminding us what's important.
Yeah, and the Accessibility Directorate is always available. I don't have my email address on the slide, but if you email accessibility@novascotia.ca, you'll get the right staff person for whatever you're looking for. So if you have questions as you're designing, if you're looking for sort of subject matter expertise, please engage us at any point.
Thank you for coming in. I'll just say we have a large population in Chester Municipality with disabilities. You said almost 40%. We have quite a few clients that live at Bonneview Farm.
Yes.
And they're all disabled in some manner. And I know they look forward to some of these changes that will happen in the community.
Yes.
Because with the remedy, they're all going to be going into the community more, and they will be wanting this access.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's good work.
Yeah. Thank you. As Tina said, we're thinking about our space issues here. I'm sure you were briefed before you came in. We're thinking about whether we need a new municipal building, or should we move some of our staff on site, and if we do that, do we have to do something to this building, etc. In your presentation, you mentioned detecting non-compliance. Can you elaborate on what that actually means?
Yeah, thank you. So currently the standard is not yet enacted, but once the standard has been adopted and it is law, a case of non-compliance would be, and let's just use an example from the proposed standard. So let's say the proposed standard says that new curb ramps, let's use this as an easy example. Let's say that new curb ramps have to have the tactile indicators on them so that folks with low vision can guide themselves with their canes. So let's say, I'm making this up. Let's say Chester makes new curb ramps and you don't include tactile indicators in any of them, but that would be a case of non-compliance. Currently, if that happens, it's not non-compliance because the standard is not yet enforced and enacted, but once it is in place, then yeah.
Yeah, just to follow up. So, yeah, and I thought so. Now, in terms of our building, and this will form part of these standards will form part of the building code, presumably, or be referenced in some way by the building code. So any modifications to this building we were to make should be picked up through the building inspection process.
Yes.
One of the there's sort of two camps on this issue. Those who may wish to just have a clean slate and build a new building in full compliance with the building code. And then maybe others that may say, okay, well, why don't we do something different, either modify or move part of our staff off-site into a different building and just have a smaller project. And one of the sort of discussion points has been around, well, what will we have to do with this existing space to bring it into compliance? Mm-hmm. And, for example, like let's say that light switches, my favorite example, have to be placed at a certain height above the floor to meet the new standard, and ours aren't.
Right.
Does that mean that we have to tear every building, this whole building apart and rewire the building? Or does it mean that if we move a wall and that light switch is in that wall, then we move the light switch down?
Yeah, so same as how the building code is enforced now, it applies to the area of the space that is being redeveloped. So an example, let's say you're replacing all of your exterior doors. All those doors are now going to need to be the right width and have power door openers. But what that doesn't mean is that this whole space, if you're not redeveloping the inside, it doesn't mean you have to go inside and redevelop that whole space. The building code would apply to the area that's being worked on. Yeah.
That has always been my understanding. As codes march on,
Yes.
in Nova Scotia, I would estimate 80 or 90% of buildings are below code because they were built to the code of the day.
That's right.
Codes march on.
That's right.
We don't continuously go back to old buildings and continue to build them to a higher standard.
That's right. What I will say is that we'll be working with Municipal Affairs and Housing when the new code is adopted. There's always training that's required by building officials, as you probably know, and we've been working with them to include accessibility training. What building officials should be saying is this is the requirement and this is what we'd recommend. If you want to make additional improvements, here are some recommendations. But again, only the regulations that are in place would be the actual requirement. Yeah.
Gary?
Thank you for your presentation. Very interesting. I want to ask you a question about the 40% or 38% disability. Yes. There must be categories of disability, though.
For sure.
So how do you define the different categories? There's slight, a lot in between, but you must have something a little more sophisticated than that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So our definition of disability within our act is quite broad, and it can even include temporary or episodic disabilities. So if you had a broken leg right now, that would be a temporary disability, for example. So we use a broad definition of disability. The stats, though, that you're referencing, that I used at the beginning of my slide, those are from the Canadian Survey on Disability. And so that's done by StatsCan, and so their definition of disability is what's used here. And they don't, in terms of these rates that are on the slide, there's not a sort of categorization of severe or moderate disability. It's whether you identify as having a disability or not. And so, for example, the 37.9, that could include invisible disabilities. It could include folks who are blind or partially sighted, deaf or neurodivergent. And what it might not include is people who don't say, hi, I have a disability. So the number might actually be quite higher than that. There are, like I said earlier, there's a lot of folks who are aging who just, they grew up and they never wanted to associate with the word disability, and so they might not. And even younger folks might not. So this is just a matter of who sort of checks that box on the StatsCan survey that they do. It's called the Canadian Survey on Disability.
So we don't know how many of this 40% would need an elevator.
That's right. So certainly not all 37.9% would be wheelchair users, for example. Yeah.
So it really is an interesting stat. I don't know how much it helps us in trying to refit a building.
Right.
No, it's hard to know what the local need is.
Yes, yeah, it might be different. But I don't know if you've ever met Jerry Post. He used to be the executive director at the directorate. He's often said, I'm just one person and I use a wheelchair, but I go out with my whole family. I go out with my friends. And so we like to remind folks that, you know, if your restaurant, for example, isn't accessible, or your shop, and if someone's looking to wheel in and have dinner with their family, you're not only turning away the one person with a disability, you're turning away everybody who would join them. So it could be a larger volume of customers, actually. So it depends on how you look at it.
No, I get that. I really do.
Yeah.
But I do think that number is somewhat misleading.
There's different ways to look at it, and you can get into, we do have a breakdown. I can send it following.
To see it.
Yeah, there is a breakdown of this data. We just share it at a high level. Yeah.
Dana?
Thank you. I just can't resist. Andre made reference to the two camps here and a discussion around building new, renovating, and so on. So if we are looking, certainly we are considering strongly the renovating side of things. I will further add to Andre's comments around what we have to do and what we should do. And I know that there are two camps with that train of thought as well. And so I want to especially thank you for the slide where you reference organizations are encouraged to strive for accessibility beyond standards where possible.
Yes.
So that is certainly something. I know, again, it's a healthy discussion at this table, so moving forward. So couldn't resist.
Yeah,
Andre,
thank
he
you.
can't help himself.
No, they're both really great points, and that's where your accessibility plan as a municipality might be a great spot to say, okay, well, we know we have to comply with the standard. What are we hearing from community? What do we know that really needs to be addressed? Maybe it's the doors to spaces having automatic door openers. So maybe you want to commit to more tangible actions that you want to commit to in your plans, and that might be things that aren't required by the standard, but are good and important pieces to work on.
Andre?
So let's distill for us. This is a budgetary discussion
Yes.
that you're getting drug into. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So one side of this argument is talking about maybe, let's say we're going to move some staff into a separate building off-site, and we're just going to continue to use this building, maybe move some desks around, reshuffle things or whatever. Mm-hmm. The standard as I understand it, I'm waiting for you to correct me if I'm wrong, please. This building complies with the standard because we haven't touched it.
That's right.
As soon as we open it up, those affected areas may be non-compliant, may need to be addressed. So one side of this discussion has been bludgeoned repeatedly by the $1.8 million it would take to upfit this building to comply with the standard, but it's in compliance now, actually, by not touching it.
That's right.
Just as my 1978 bungalow is in compliance with the building code now,
Yes.
until I renovate it.
That's right, mine as well, yeah.
So it's not a discussion of standards. And then if we get into this other discussion of what should we do and what shouldn't we do, one side of this argument is then fighting a ghost. Because it's like, how do you argue that point? Like at what level do you upgrade a building to be in compliance with a standard when you're already in compliance with the standard already? So it's not really about standards, it's about what you should do. That's a whole other discussion, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that number becomes irrelevant of 1.8 million. Then it's like, what things would we like to do to enhance our accessibility?
Right,
And we can put a number on that.
yes.
And that would be a more meaningful conversation than being hammered all the time when we talk about this, about $1.8 million to upgrade this building. That's fake news.
Yeah, so certain, and it's the building, when we're talking about the building itself, we're talking about the building code, right? So, and we know the building code doesn't apply retroactively.
Yeah.
So yes, one way you might want to look at it is who's coming in the building, survey them, what are the needs of the people in the space? So for example, our own government, our own public works will do this when acquiring office space for government employees. What are the needs of the people in that space? Maybe you don't need, let's say, an adult change table in the space. That's a high ticket item and costs a lot of money. If you don't need it in a space like this, then right, maybe that doesn't need to factor into your budget conversation. But what are the pieces that people do need? What is the space that's required? That kind of thing.
I would welcome that conversation.
Yeah.
I can tell from Ellen's body language she wants to say something.
I do. You've referenced the 1.8 million, and I think it was clear when that accessibility audit was presented that was best practice. It was kind of placed against the standard that Maddie referenced, which was the CSA B651 20, I don't know if it was 23 at that point, it would have been 18 at that point. So it was best practice. So the 1.8 million is to get this space to best practice, which includes things like making sure someone who uses a wheelchair can come to a council meeting and use the washroom without having to go downstairs, right? So there are certain things that, we don't meet the building code right now, or, the upgraded building code that we expect to be passed this year. But you're right, you're in compliance, but you're not meeting the needs of the community, right? So it is two different
Yeah, well, I think that we need to open up that list of items there and actually see, because I'm sure there may be things in there that are important, maybe the one you cited.
Yeah.
There may be other things that are just like, well, maybe the cost doesn't justify the reward.
Right.
Yeah, and there are other solutions. Like you've used the light switch one several times.
I love that one.
I know. It's because it's a hard one to argue against, right? Because it's
That's why I
high
use it.
cost. But it's high cost, and you're right. It doesn't apply to most people.
Yeah.
But I think the argument that someone else can put the light is sort of part of the issue with the way I'm thinking about this. Is like we have all of these features that somebody with a disability, and yes, wide range of disability, but we have all of these features that are not accessible for someone with a disability, and they're not here, right? Like because they can't, it's hard to access this space, right?
But that light switch one is a perfect example of, like, realistically, yes, we're not in compliance, but the lights get turned on in the morning by somebody.
Right.
The
Yeah.
regular person
Right.
that uses this building
Right.
doesn't turn on or off the lights.
Right.
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
like one person probably turns on the light in the morning.
So it's a matter of prioritization. And the other thing I would say is, maybe you can't do it all ever, but maybe it's maybe some pieces you can't do right now. And that's where accessibility plans can come in. It's like, what are the pieces you want to look at in the next few years? And what are some pieces you might want to look at 5 years out, 10 years out? And so I would look at it as a prioritization activity in terms of you could survey folks with disabilities in the community. If they wanted to be able to access their local government, what do they need? And then audit the space based on, or use your audit you have of the space and say, okay, what's needed to be able to bring someone in to access?
I guess where I'm kind of headed with all this is that our current assessment from a financial standpoint lacks the sophistication we need to actually make an appropriate decision from a budgetary standpoint. Because, you know, you get hit with that big number, but it could include a whole bunch of stuff that are really small benefits. But they're in there mixed, there's also some stuff that the other side of the argument could say, well, look, you know, people can't even go to the washroom. You know, so here we are duking it out and both sides have a few points.
Let's try to stay away from a decision that she has nothing to do with.
I'm going to take the discussion in a whole
No
different,
chance.
a whole different direction. I guess, you know, we know that we have to do something in the public spaces, whatever that means. But my question is, when the new regulations come in for the private sector, a developer, for example, you know, we have you know, it's no secret that housing is a big issue. I'm just wondering, and you talk about balance, and I hope that in the discussion is that, okay, if I'm a developer and I want to develop something and I know it's going to cost me X amount of dollars to do this, I think there's a balance between trying to do what we're trying to do, but you still have another issue with housing. So that may be something, I don't know how they're going to work that, but that's a big question to me. How are you going to balance accessibility with actual availability?
Right.
So I hope to have those discussions and not like the federal government did with immigration and bring people, which is great, but you have nowhere to house them.
Right.
You have no dock. So this is what I see as an issue.
Yeah, so when we talk about housing, we're really talking about the sort of the 3 A's, aren't we? The availability, the affordability, and the accessibility. And all 3 are sort of equally important, and how do you balance that? The pieces around accessible housing, they fall within the code.
Okay.
And it's a certain requirement of units. So for example, if you're building a multi-unit space, the code would outline for you, okay, maybe it's 1 in 10 spaces need to be barrier-free. And so a developer would be required to comply with that. When looking at the recommendations we received from the board on behalf of Nova Scotia, some of the recommendations might have been excellent material, but maybe they weren't suitable for regulation because they're a bit too cost prohibitive or they're hard to enforce. And so some pieces might have ended up in guidelines. And so that's where the balanced approach of all this work comes in. Yeah.
Okay, we've got to bring it to a conclusion. I have a whole bunch of people out there in the hallway and they can't get in the building. And we don't have enough seating.
Yes, you're busy today.
Yes, so thank you very much and we'll continue to work with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, maybe we should, take 5 minutes because we got staff are gonna have to move out. Those that aren't required to still be here for the
Well, they can stay.
volunteer awards. And we gotta bring the volunteers in. So, we'll take 5 minutes.